Don't you hate it when you're like semi-conscious about to go to sleep and you kind of look over because your eyes are half open and you see like 3 hand-sized spiders crawling down your window and then they go behind your headboard? Because I hate when that happens. How's it going out there? I'm Weston. For those of you that don't know, I'm a writer and I typically write books and TV and stuff featuring teenagers with frightening superpowers who run for their lives. So today I've been thinking a lot about the beginning of stories. Not actually starting stories, I did a video about that, but about the sort of first couple of moments of a story. And especially science fiction and fantasy stories. There's a lot of nuance to beginning a story. There's a lot that you want to get right, and there's things that I've noticed that if you're a less experienced storyteller or writer, there's mistakes that tend to get made a lot. So I thought it'd be fun to run down a list of what I see as like the top 5 rookie mistakes in like science fiction and fantasy storytelling. And you know, before we go on, so my opinions, you might think that some of these are really good. And as I stated in the first video I ever put on YouTube, what you get right matters more than what you get wrong. So it's very possible that some of these things might show up in your story or a story you love, and you love it anyways, and that's totally fine. They're just opinions. Number 1 rookie mistake when starting a science fiction or fantasy story is, tell, don't show. So instead of letting us into the world organically, you have a big amount of exposition at the front. Like a huge title crawl, 5 paragraphs of information. I know there's great stories out there that do this, but just hear me out. More inexperienced writers will spend a ton of time at the beginning of the story, not even like telling the story so much as saying like, hey, this is a city planet, and here's the rules of all these city planets. And there's just nothing in there to really hook you into the story because you're spending so much time laying groundwork. I had a great writing teacher once upon a time who always would say, you have to answer the question, what's at stake? What's in danger of being lost? And at the beginning, what's in danger of being lost is the audience. Now, you do need to lay that pipe for your audience, and that is very, very hard. And, so what are examples of how to do it right? So I've heard the going theory about, introducing people to strange worlds and stories. There's like 2 ways to do it. You have either a character that goes into that world, if we're thinking about The Last Starfighter or any number of other stories like that, where there's an outsider character that's welcomed in, and you learn about the story that way because they need to learn about it. And then the other way is to just have the world fully formed and you just kind of have to figure it out. There's no right way to think about this. My going theory is that both are actually the same type of thing, where you have to get the audience settled in. And yes, one easy way to do is to have somebody introduced, but you can also do it a couple of other ways. Like for example, Game of Thrones, the TV series and the book, both kind of, those worlds exist fully formed. There's no person from our time that gets sucked into a book, never-ending story style, and ends up in that world. They're just there. But we are still introduced to that world in time. We start out with the most important thing we need to know, which is that there's this wall and there's guys trying to protect it and there's monsters on the other side of it. Then we go to the other side of the wall and we're kind of like led through this path, almost like a theme park. This linear path that introduces us to, it's like, okay, well, what's on the other side of the wall? Well, it's, a castle with a pretty good guy in it. He seems like an all right dude. Well, all right, we'll watch him and his family hang out for a little while. Okay, number 2, rookie mistakes. They don't think through what's not in the world. What I mean is that sci-fi and fantasy worlds are compelling and feel strange to us because of what's omitted that's normal to us. And sometimes that's a little thing. Sometimes it's like, the Battlestar Galactica reboot, which is basically our world in the 2000s. They make it feel different by cutting the corners off of paper. Just tiny little things like that. Or it might be that in this world there's no phones, there's no TV screens. What's normal to us that's not in this other place? All right, number 3, Being too worried about getting it right and kind of disconnecting what you love about the story. So, a really common rookie mistake, I used to be so guilty of this, is that the writer is so focused in the beginning of this story on hitting beats and doing it structurally right that they kind of lose track of what made them love this world in the first place. Staying connected to what you're passionate about as a storyteller is so important, because we can all tell that you don't care about X, Y, or Z because you want to get to the part where they're in the cool forest with the talking trees, or I don't know, whatever. And as always, if you're somebody like me who worries so much about getting it right, especially at the beginning of a story, hitting all the beats to set things up and put your Chekhov's guns on shelves and blah, 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 just remember, again, what you get right matters more than what you get wrong. And odds are, if you're passionate about something, it's got a way better chance of landing with an audience person. It'll be something that you get really right. So don't lose sight of that stuff. And number 4 is a counterpoint to that. Don't get too hung up on the cool stuff in your story. You know what I'm talking about. It's your lightsabers, it's your crazy superpowers, it's your badass spaceship fights, the things that are in fantasy world. That one sword that cuts through everything, that eagle that used to be a person. You can get too hung up on the cool stuff at the expense of telling a great story at any point in the story, but it's especially risky at the beginning. How much of the cool stuff that you love in genre fiction shows up right in the first 5 minutes or the first 10 pages of a story or something like that? Think about Ghostbusters, for example. There's no proton packs until, close to the halfway point of the movie. There's no real lightsaber until, minute 15 or 20 of Star Wars? And there's no lightsaber fights until, no legit lightsaber fights until the second Star Wars movie. Never forget, that cool stuff exists to assist in telling the story. It's not the point of the story. So if you have a cool thing, if it's wish fulfillment, if it's a cool thing that we've wanted to see or that you really want to show us, don't throw it out right in the beginning, man. You got to tease that stuff out. Last, and definitely most important, biggest rookie mistake at the start of a story, a new writer may not do the best job of setting audience expectations. What's an audience expectation? Well, it's your audience's expectations for the story based on what you are told them first. The first part of a story, even the first sentence or the first image in a movie or a TV show, is such a key promise to an audience. It sets that audience expectation for the scope of the thing. And it's so important. In film theory, they get into the idea of the opening image. And it's really, if we're being honest, it's not always just an image. That's a very strict and kind of limited way of looking at this. In a story, especially a genre story, where you're kind of treading new ground, you gotta think a lot about this. You've got to really dig in and say, what is the scope of this story? Because if you don't deliver on the promise at the start of a thing, our pattern recognition engines in our brains flip out. It gets so weird. What was I'll put the name of the composer below, but there's some classical composer that intentionally didn't deliver on the theme, the melody that he was building through an orchestra or a symphony, a piece of music, and people would get into fights in the audience because it's so deliberately confounding. So how do you deliver on this stuff? Well, my favorite example of this is Dark City, the 1998 Alex Proyas movie. It's super cool. If you've never seen it, one of my favorites. In Dark City, the opening image of the movie gives away the plot twist. And Dark City has a wild plot twist. It starts out as this very impressionistic noir film. The plot twist is they're on a spaceship. And what's the opening image of Dark City? A starfield. So on some level, that's a super wild plot twist, but they had to telegraph it. Or you would have been like, what the? The other thing about setting audience expectations, to go back to, which number was it? Number 1 on the list. If you're gonna set up a complex world and you've gotta set the expectations early and give us some hint of the scope of the story, you gotta also make it interesting. An experienced storyteller knows how important this is, and they'll come back and iterate it on the beginning. And they'll find that, maybe something needs to change, or they need to add something in, or they need to tweak it because they're not quite setting the tone of what the story ended up being. set those audience expectations. At least think about it. You gotta try this stuff and get it wrong from time to time. All right, I hope that list was valuable, give you something to think about. If you agree or disagree, comments below, make it happen, blah, blah, blah. Go tell stories. I'll see you soon.